Good afternoon, everyone. I thank the organizers for this invitation. So in the next couple of minutes, we'll be discussing the role of nurses in addressing pediatric oncological emergencies. So I work in a center which is very close to New Delhi. It is in Noida, which is part of Uttar Pradesh. We cater to patients who belong to Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, as well as some neighboring states as well. We started the department roughly 4 years back with this team of 6 nurses and a nursing in charge. And from there, we have slowly built up services. So currently, we have around 22 to 24 nurses at any point of time who are involved in cancer patients. And we had shared our experience in PSYOP 2018 as well. So most of the nurses that we are getting are nurses. Forget nurses who are oncology trained, we are getting nurses who are naive to pediatrics itself. So most of them are fresh nurses. So we start from the big, and so for a fresh nurse who comes into our department, it is an intimidating experience. Like all that ma'am was talking till now, like washing hands again and again, wearing mask, wearing gloves, all that is very new to them. At least in the pre-COVID era, it was new to them. So it is as many new nurses are scared to come into the department. But over the years, we have done. They've become very friendly to the patients, and it's now they are the ones who are actually running the service. So when we talk about the role of pediatric nurses in cancer care, we have, other than giving them the treatment, which is being charted by the doctor, that is really 25% of the work. The rest of it is what is important. That would include optimal supportive care, both prevention of infections, what ma'am discussed, as well as treatment of infections correctly, education of families, children, and other healthcare workers. A lot of education goes in this, that as a responsibility of the nurse, because when we started off, at least we did not have social workers, we did not have a dietitian, we did not have any patient support group with us. But over the years, so then the whole emphasis or the onus was on the nurse to provide all these services, and they took up the challenge very well. They would also provide psychosocial support to families. They would give nutrition counseling as well as infection prevention counseling. Nowadays, even though we have all these support staff, still nurses are encouraged to speak to families like that. So they are the primary care providers in our center. And I think it is a sustainable option for many pediatric cancer units, especially in low and middle income economies, because we are never going to get trained doctors to that extent. We're not going to get at every center round the clock 24-hour support by doctors who are trained in pediatric cancer. So nurses become the front line or the first line of defense, as we would call in infections, and they are a 24-hour support to our patients. So nursing, at least in LMICs, would now transfer from a passive role to an active role in cancer care. So now, as per WHO, from the next 10 years from now, as in 9 years from now, we should be aiming at this. We should be aiming at improving survival. Currently, in low and middle income countries, we have just about 20% survival compared to high income countries, where the manpower for doing this job is the ratio of patient to nurse ratio as well as patient to doctor ratio is much better in a high income country. So now we'll see what are the oncological emergencies, and for every emergency, how can nurses be a part of prevention as well as management of it. So oncological emergencies are potentially life-threatening events. So if you do not anticipate it, or if you don't treat it immediately, that can result either in permanent morbidity or even mortality of the patient. So this is how I would classify pediatric oncological emergencies. It could be infection-related, metabolic emergencies, mechanical emergencies, gastrointestinal emergencies, hematological emergencies, and neurological emergencies. We'll see few of the most important ones today. Infection-related emergency would be febrile neutropenia. All nurses who work in a pediatric cancer unit or a cancer unit, an adult unit also would have heard about this term. We know why it is so important and why this is actually classified as an emergency and not as a routine fever. Metabolic emergencies would include tumor lysis. So there is a constellation of biochemical abnormalities that come in, which include raised potassium, raised phosphorus, raised uric acid, and reduced calcium. SIADH, where you get hyponatremia, and hypercalcemia, which may be seen rarely as part of pediatric cancers also. Mechanical emergencies is when the tumor or the mass is compressing on an organ and causing problems. It could be superior vena cava syndrome, it could be spinal cord compression because of a paraspinal mass, or it could be raised intracranial tension, again because of a brain tumor or another mass which is compressing and increasing the pressure inside the brain. Gastrointestinal emergencies would be neutropenic enterocolitis, very, very commonly seen with high-end chemotherapy, bowel obstruction or perforation, again, occasionally seen even today, even with all the supportive care we do have. Hematological emergencies, again, very, very common. Many malignancies come with very high white cell count, so that's called hyperleukocytosis, which is prone for tumor lysis syndrome. Thrombocytopenia is again probably the commonest hematological problem that we face in addition to anemia, and at times because of sepsis or because of the disease per se, we may have what is called disseminated intravascular coagulation. So all these cause are hematological emergencies to deal with. And finally, at neurological emergencies, anytime in the ward, any child could throw a seizure, child could go into altered sensorium. So these are things which we routinely see in our wards, and this again classify as pediatric oncological emergencies. So fever in a cancer child is the most common symptom that we see, and every single episode of we cannot disregard a fever in a cancer child. So starting from the emergency resident, the medical officer sitting in your emergency, from every nurse who is there in that chain should be aware of this fact that fever should never be disregarded in a cancer child, because you never know what the bug is and you never know which child will go wrong. So this is the the Infectious Disease Society of America definition for fever. So these are very standard definitions for fever as well as neutropenia. So what we standard advice we give to the families is any temperature, you're coming more than 100 degrees, the family, even if they are away from, not in the hospital, they are to report, they are to tell us at least on the phone that the child is having fever, and then we'll take it up as it goes. So as nurses who are in emergency care, never send back any child who has come with a fever, especially if a child is being brought at night, never send them back. Always the child has to be shown to a senior person. When I say senior, many of the emergency doctors who are posted in emergency rotations are usually first year residents, and they also may not be aware. They may not be aware as much as you know. So that it is very important that nurses are aware that the cancer patient who comes should be shown immediately and should be shown to a senior doctor, especially if you have decided to send them back. If you have decided to admit, well and good, the child will be anyway seen by a senior person. 90% of children would require IV treatment, and so it is important, even if it was fever like 2 hours ago, now the child is afebrile, even then the child needs to be evaluated further. And when the child comes to our ward, the child should receive the first antibiotic. So there is a golden hour concept in many diseases. Similarly here, it has been shown by multiple studies that if we give the first shot of antibiotic within 30 minutes to 60 minutes, the mortality reduces significantly. So at least 1 hour is a reasonable time frame where you can tell the family to reach the hospital and get an antibiotic shot. And if the family is away, we usually tell them to carry antibiotics with them so that it can be given at a local hospital. Culture samples are usually taken, even if your hospital is not running the culture immediately, it can be taken and kept and sample be processed the next day morning. That is fine. But culture has to be taken and an antibiotic shot has to be given as prescribed by the doctor. Always monitor vitals, urine output, and sensorium. Most chemotherapy protocols that we are using, whether it is solid tumors or hematological malignancy, there would be neutropenia, which starts at around 7 to 10 days after the initiation of the treatment. And even in children who have not received chemotherapy at all, see, the patient is coming to you for the first time with a high white cell count. That high white cell count is essential. Even if you have not received chemotherapy, many children at diagnosis, if they are running fever, they would still need to be treated as an emergency, and antibiotics may need to be given to them as well. And why are we so bothered about neutrophils? Neutrophils are required in our body to localize infection to a site. So if you have a tonsillitis, the infection should remain in the tonsil and not go into the bloodstream, and that is done by the neutrophils. But if you don't have neutrophils, neutrophils, then there will be dissemination of infection, and that can go into systemic sepsis and all the complications like that. So way back when antibiotics were not so popular, neutropenia, sepsis, the mortality rate used to be around 50%. So out of 10 children who are coming in with fever and neutropenia, 5 would die of the infection. So that is the emergency that we need to push in antibiotics as early as possible. And it's not like general pediatrics where you can wait and watch for a day or two if you're not sure if it is viral versus bacterial. All that is not there in pediatric cancer practice. And with proper management, less than 5% mortality is noted. And in very good centers, and mortality is reported. And when the child comes in, like I said earlier, we have no reliable way of knowing which child is going to go wrong. Although there are some ways of assessing low risk and high risk, but essentially till the time we do all that, all children should be considered as high risk. And when you see the child in a pediatric daycare or a emergency ward, ask them, when did the fever start? Or is there any other difficulty? This is all symptoms which tell you what the focus of infection can be. Many a times there will not be a focus, there'll be just fever. So that also it should be managed equally. And always examine the child. If the doctor is busy, examine the oral cavity, the skin, the perineal area, and daily during your rounds also, it is important to see all this, because many a times these doctors would come, but the nurse is with the patient 24 hours. So these things get picked up very much better, in a better way, when if the nurse is alert. And don't expect pus anywhere, just redness. It's also with just pain and redness. Then you just remove the cannula if you're using a referral line. And all, if they are receiving chemotherapy. So these are the investigations that we send out. Blood culture, mandate mention culture. Paired samples are taken out usually. Every unit would have its policy. And blood culture, how to clean the skin properly so that you should ask for unit policy. Everybody would know what is a keep spare antibiotics in your ward. So if it's of whatever your first line antibiotic is, so that in an emergency, if the patient is not able to go and buy it, or if there is a long queue in pharmacy, things like that, you can always start off treatment without waiting. And if we treat it properly, the survival is very good. When you see children in your ward daily, vitals to be monitored, peripheries can be touched and seen, whether they are warm, cold, if there is bounding pulse, the skin, how is it looking, if it is edematous, mottled, all of this actually are very, very good signs of telling you that the sepsis is worsening and you need to act fast. Oral cavity again should be looked into. Also look for symptoms, urine output should be calculated properly, and fluid has to be assessed again. If the child is taking very well orally, maybe not fluids, but most sick children do not take orally or have mucositis, then again fluid boluses may be required if they are hypotensive. And paracetamol, again in the emergency, if a doctor is prescribing an NSAID like mefenamic acid or brufen, etc., that should not be given in our patients because they are thrombocytopenic already, and they can have worsening of platelet bleeding if you give agents which have platelet dysfunction, and it can go really, really bad in a few hours time. So that is why we are really worried about febrile neutropenia. Now coming to mechanical emergencies. So the most common ones which we would face is basically airway, because leukemia lymphomas are common. And these conditions, when there is a lot of tumor disease in the mediastinum, that can compress the superior vena cava. It is called superior vena cava syndrome. And sometimes it can cause tracheal compression along with superior vena caval compression, which is called superior mediastinal syndrome. For children, this is essentially the same. There is not much of difference because the chest wall is small. So most of superior vena cava syndrome will eventually have some amount of tracheal compression as well. So we use these terms interchangeably. 60% of pediatric mediastinal masses would have airway obstruction, and these are the common conditions which cause it. And because trachea and bronchi are easily compressible, children can have airway obstruction very early. So starting off, it will be just venous compression here, but later it will be respiratory compromise. And after a while, when the hypoxia starts setting in, there will be CNS involvement also. And even when there is compression here, the brain, the venous drainage from the brain is not occurring. That also causes headache, lethargy, etc. So that is also common. If a child is if it's having difficulty in breathing, it is short bouts of coughing, prefers to sit always. That is all very, very ominous signs. And the doctor, if you are in an emergency care, you should always alert the doctor to see this patient first before seeing another one, because these children deteriorate very quickly. And after a half an hour or 1 hour, it might be a much worse situation. If the child is having stridor or wheezing, hoarse voice, complaining of chest pain, flushed face, these are all symptoms where you should consider superior vena cava syndrome. And because we have obstruction in the, if see, these veins are going to drain from the upper limbs also. So because of that, there will be edema of the upper limbs already. So that is why we discourage people from putting IV cannula in the upper limbs, because already there is compression. On top of that, if you put an IV cannula on the upper limb and give fluids through that, that will worsen the edema and congestion. Always in such children, preferably in the lower limb, cannula is put. So these are the usual conditions based on if it's an anterior mediastinum, middle, or a posterior in the mediastinum. These are the malignant causes of superior mediastinal syndrome. And this is how a chest X-ray would look. If you see closely, there is a tracheal compression. So that black, the air, the lucency, it is actually getting compressed here because of the mass there. It's probably a lymphoma. And why are we so worried about this? Because this is a sin. So this, if you imagine the scenario and there is a tumor which is compressing on the vein, and suppose what happens in supine position, this diaphragm is going to get pushed up and this tumor is going to further compress the trachea. So in supine position, or when you sedate the child, when your respiratory muscles and the child is sensorium is not so good. Whenever you manage such a child, always be aware of airway, keep oxygen in hand, or maybe you start oxygen already. Avoid sedation, and sedation is always big no-no, especially if you are sending for investigations. All sedation is to be avoided. So CT scan can be done without sedation also after calming the child a bit. Why are we worried? Because once you go into respiratory arrest, it's difficult to intubate, because you remember the narrow trachea. It is very difficult to put a tube through that narrow trachea. And even if you manage to put a tube, say, it will be difficult to extubate also, because it will all collapse, and that extubation also becomes very prolonged. So that is why supine positioning and sedation has to be completely avoided in these children. Even bone marrow is done usually in a sitting position, and we keep intubation equipment always ready. Another area where nurses can help is to keep the child calm. So your parents keep the child a little relaxed, so that the effort is not gone on crying and raising the pressures again. Venous access should be in the lower limb. And here again, because most of the conditions are either lymphoma or leukemia usually, steroids we generally avoid till the time we get a diagnosis, because if it's such a massive mass and you're going to give steroids, say suppose in peripheral setup, when this any child goes with respiratory difficulty, usually dexamethasone is given very freely. So when you give dexamethasone to such a child with a huge mass like we saw in the chest X-ray, that is going to increase tumor lysis, and that also may interfere with our diagnosis, because many a times the blasts also get lysed, and when the child gets 2-3 days later, when the child gets a bone marrow, you may not have enough cells to get a diagnosis properly. So no pre-medication for these children with steroid at least, and avoid steroids as much as possible. And prop up the child, start oxygen, venous access we discussed. Another point where there is usually a loophole is when you're shifting for an investigation. Try and get investigations there. If you have a bedside X-ray, that would be better. If you are sending for CT scan, always send with oxygen. Always keep the child sitting when you're sending for oxygen, because you've done all this in the ward. When you're shifting with an attendant to the CT room, the child will take at least 1 hour there. And by the time the child returns, the child will be in such a bad shape. So that has to be avoided. And somebody sensible has to accompany the patient to make sure that the child is not kept supine there. And all these orders which we are doing in the ward has to be followed there also. So these are the things which we can do as nurses, which can be followed in children with superior mediastinal syndrome. Of course, from a treatment point of view, we'll try and get to a diagnosis early and start treatment as early as possible, so that the resolution of mass occurs as early, and the distress also comes down significantly. So these are children. So this is a child with mass who turned out to be leukemia. So or T-cell ALLs that present like this. This is another child with a T-cell ALL who has come with a massive mass. So the precautions that you would take while if you're in a center which is transporting it to the patient to a higher center for treatment, always sitting position, no steroids, no sedation, IV line in the leg should be followed as a blanket rule for all superior mediastinal syndromes. Another area where there can be mechanical compression is abdominal mass. Here again, these masses can be seen with any of these malignancies. It could be neuroblastoma, lymphoma, Wilms tumor, or a giant teratoma as well. And a third location where mechanical compression occurs is the brain, where if it can be a primary brain tumor or a metastasis which can cause these kind of obstructions, what do you look out for? Headache in a child vomiting, altered sensorium, all are important. All these medicines should be avoided. 3% saline mannitol, head and can be elevated, and nurses should have primary knowledge on how to manage seizures, because by the time you call a doctor and the doctor reaches, it will always be, even if the doctor is in an adjacent ward, it will take say 2 to 3 minutes. You have a lot of time till then to manage. So midazolam nasal spray or even IV midazolam should be kept ready so that you can immediately administer it. And nurses, we encourage them to undergo basic airway management, BLS, ALS support as well. Third oncological emergency that we will deal today is tumor lysis syndrome. So we saw all those patients who had massive abdominal mass or mediastinal mass. Sometimes spontaneously or sometimes following chemotherapy, these cells started lysing. So spontaneous is usually seen in Burkitt lymphoma, and following chemotherapy in all highly sensitive tumors, this is seen. So it's usually commonly seen with ALL and sometimes in So what happens when the tumor lyses? Some things come out of the cell. So all these things, from the DNA inside the cell, phosphorus is being made, result in renal insufficiency or cardiac called tumor lysis syndrome. Now, what is the problem is the clinical features of tumor lysis syndrome aren't any specific. So a child can have just nausea or anorexia, just complaints which can be seen with many other diseases. So unless you think about it and get the biochemical evaluation done, we may miss these kind of conditions. So that is why this scoring has been suggested, called Cairo and Bishop definition for tumor lysis. This is in millimoles, but you can have it in per deciliter as well. So whenever there is a patient in your ward who is coming in with these kind of reports, these are lab alerts that should be informed to the treating doctor. So that it cannot disregard a potassium more than, say, 6 I've written, but even more than 5, it should be told to the treating team. Phosphorus high, low calcium, high uric acid, this has to be informed. And in many sick children, although not part of TLS, sodium will be low. So that also, so these lab alerts should be known to all nurses who are treating, and that should be informed so that you can act on it before the clinical features come in, because clinical features like you see are all kind of very terminal. So you don't want the child. So again, the grading of TLS, see, by the time from a stage 0 to a 5 is very short. So by the time you act on it, it might be too late if you're not too conscious about it. So these things should be prevented at all costs. So what do we do for these children? We generally add a lot of fluid, double maintenance fluids, hydrate the child well, alkalize it at times to increase the uric acid solubility. These are drugs which are used to reduce the uric acid level in your body, and definitely treat the malignancy so that also helps in reducing the tumor burden. As nurses, what should be known? Couple of things. Whenever double maintenance fluids or fluids are charted, either for TLS or for chemotherapy, we should know, the nurses should know how to calculate the drip rate. That has to be taught to them, especially nurses who are naive to pediatrics will not know this. That has to be taught to them. Another option which we have figured out, because it's so difficult to teach every single time a drip rate, is that they calculate 6 hours. The shifts are usually in 6 hour, 6 hour and 12 hour slots. So we tell them that during your 6 hours, this is the amount of fluid that has has to go in. So even if it is like a little, it's like 10% here or there, but still they ensure that so much fluids go in. Or you calculate the number of bottles that have to be given over 24 hours, keep it near the patient so that you are sure that the number of vials, if it is 3 liters, 6 bottles should be out there, so that that amount of fluid goes in. So this is extremely important, and that has to be adhered to. Generally in pediatrics, for all maintenance fluid, potassium is added, but here when you have a fresh child with a patient who has just walked in with a suspected leukemia, never add potassium in fluids, because you don't, unless you have the potassium value. And even if you have potassium value in the normal range, if you're going to start treatment for cancer, then you generally don't add potassium, because you are expecting tumor lysis in these patients. Many children would require bicarbonate for tumor lysis management. And if you're using this agent called rasburicase, bicarbonate is usually stopped. The sample for uric acid, I've not forgotten to write here, but sample for uric acid has to go in an ice box, so that the level of uric acid is correctly measured. And always before rasburicase, we measure G6PD levels as well. And so nurses would monitor all this. If there is bradycardia, irregular heartbeats, they have to inform the senior person. Urine output, you should know how to calculate urine output, how the parents have to be taught to calculate urine output. Sensorium should be assessed, and urine pH also is assessed as part of tumor lysis management. This is something very simple which we use in our ward, where urine strips are given. So the nurses only manage all the pH management without sending the sample to the lab. So this is the detailed management of tumor lysis. I think we mentioned most of it, except one thing which I have forgotten to mention earlier, is packed red cells. So we have very high counts like hyperleukocytosis, WBC count, which is very high, say 1 to 2 lakhs. We generally would avoid packed RBC transfusions, but you would give platelet transfusion. That also has to be kept in mind, because many a times a nurse is actually much better of managing these patients than a new resident is. So that is why these things have to be kept. And bleeding, of course, will keep happening in all of our patients. It could be thrombocytopenia, it could be coagulopathy, it could be because of any local cause. Do not panic. If the parents will definitely panic, the child will definitely panic, but you should not panic as nurses. So it's a common complaint. Just ask them to apply adequate pressure for 15 to 20 minutes. Most bleeding, at least epistaxis, would subside like this. If it is a gum bleed, you can just apply local pressure. These agents should be available in your ward really, so that it can be used. And of course, inform the family. So when they see you calm, then they also calm down. Always be prepared for emergency. Crash cart should be checked at every shift in the hospital. Maintain calm attitude, counsel parents. If you have a sick child, then start counseling early. That's so that you don't want to face angry relatives later. And always keep some antibiotics. Some most emergency medicine should be readily available. And think of making SOPs for all eventualities. I'll share some SOPs now. And of course, when you have spare time, start teaching your juniors, because teaching is the best way to learn per se. So if you have no staff nurses who are coming in, always teach them the correct ways. And that is how the department builds. So these are some SOPs as to if you have a seizure, what would you do? The first nurse, what should they do? The second nurse, what would you? So these kind of things we have developed, because we are running a service which is essentially heavily dependent on nurses. So these are things which would help all units. And what are the emergencies where we do not send any child home without speaking to the faculty? So these are things which we have done. And I think the gap between 20% to 80% can be bridged on a sustainable model by training nurses. And that even though if we improve diagnostics or treatment, all that, there is an element of, then that's also only so much that you can do in those things. But training nurses and empowering them to treat always helps a lot. So I thank our institute, as well as the support we have been receiving from the government, as well as NGOs, and from My Child Matters for a project on infections control. And I'll be happy to take questions.